In the spring of 1969, along the Long Tom River in Oregon, investigators located the body of a young woman. Her disappearance and murder was a string of unexplained incidents of missing girls in the region. Detectives would begin to unravel the pieces of a bizarre puzzle, leading them to one of the most notorious and sadistic serial killers in American history. Who was this innocent victim, and what kind of monster had brutally murdered her and dumped her in the river? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. If you enjoy what I do and want to support the show, please make sure you are following or subscribed on your platform of choice. Consider leaving a rating and a review. Your feedback and your support means more than you know. Thank you. Oregon is an absolutely mesmerizing state in the Pacific Northwest. Surrounded by majestic mountains, hiking trails with surreal waterfalls, and picturesque sandy coastal beaches. It is an ideal area to call home for nature lovers and artists at heart. In the late 1960s, the state had no more than 150 homicides in any given year. Like most of the country at that time, it saw a huge uptick in violent crime, beginning in the 1960s and peaking in the 1990s. Gone were the days of the idealistic, innocent 1950s, following the victory of World War II. The 1960s brought with it massive change. The Vietnam War, the hippie counterculture movement, widespread rebellion, and violent student protests. With these significant societal events and shifts in culture also came more murders. However, in Portland, Oregon, most of the communities were relatively safe, family-oriented, and quiet. The same pretty much rang true for its capital, Salem, which also saw a lot of cultural development in this period. For the most part, residents were not exposed to crime and violence in their neighborhoods, and the world around them still felt protected and safe. These cities and the entire state of Oregon would forever be impacted by the crimes that began in the onslaught of 1968. Linda Slauson was only 19 years old when she vanished on January 26, 1968. A pretty and determined young woman, she was driven to sell a customer a fully loaded encyclopedia set that day. For the younger listeners out there, encyclopedias were sold door to door from the 1960s through the 1980s. I personally remember fondly perusing through each letter, learning about the most fascinating people, places, and things around the world. But like other door-to-door sales, it was a challenging and not very lucrative job to sell a rather expensive set of leather-bound educational books. It had not unfolded to be this great career she was instructed and sold by the teachers of the course. She even practiced the role-playing scenarios they had been taught. But when residents opened their doors, Linda was met with frustrated, impatient people who didn't have the time to listen to what she was selling, much less the money to buy them. She figured if she just sold one entire collection, complete with the yearbooks, atlas, and all, she could pay her rent, buy some food, and even a few new clothes. On that particular night, she had been dressed very nicely, as she normally was, even wearing her heels, which ended up not being the best idea in the pouring rain. But Linda was determined to make that sale. When Linda Slauson first disappeared, everyone at her company thought she likely just quit selling encyclopedias. No one had a clue as to what residences she had visited that night. Salespeople came and went. It was part of the industry of door-to-door sales. So at the time, there was no particular reason to be concerned when she stopped showing up. However, things were different for her family, who became immediately worried and filed a missing persons report. No one in Linda Slauson's life knew where she could be. There was no trace of her at all. She had vanished. In July 1968, a 16-year-old girl named Stephanie Vilko went missing in Portland. No connection was made to the disappearance of Linda Slauson. Jan Susan Whitney was an accomplished young woman at 23 years old. She was finishing up her degree at the University of Oregon in Eugene, had her own car, a job, and a busy social life. After visiting some friends in Eugene, she left to drive back home on the I-5 to her apartment in McMinnville, but she was never seen again. The following day, her vehicle was located at the Santiam rest stop. It was locked. Except for a few personal items inside, there was no blood and no signs of a struggle that had occurred in the car. There appeared to be a minor mechanical issue, which may have led it to be inoperable. One good latent print was lifted from one of the hubcaps, but in 1968, a single latent print would have been deemed worthless to investigators. At the time, only the FBI's 10 most wanted had single prints on file. The police searched ditches and the lands along the highway, but there was no sign of the young woman. She had vanished without a trace. The last time Jan Whitney was seen was on November 26, 1968. 10 months to the day Linda Slauson had mysteriously disappeared. Oregon State Police received an anonymous letter regarding Jan Whitney. It was mailed from Albany, New York, in a plain envelope with such tedious handwriting that it appeared the writer was attempting to disguise it. In the letter, the individual claimed to have been at the rest stop where the woman's vehicle was abandoned, and indicated they had been present when she went missing. Lieutenant Robert White appealed to the public for the writer to come forward, but no one ever did. Stephanie Vilko, the 16-year-old girl who had gone missing from her Portland area home after heading out to swim in July of that year, had now been located. On March 18, 1969, a high school teacher discovered her skeletonized remains along the banks of Gale Creek. The wind, ice, water, and impact of time had made it impossible for a forensic pathologist to determine how the girl had died and whether or not she had been a victim of homicide. On March 27, 1969, a 19-year-old college student named Karen Elena Sprinker disappeared. Karen Sprinker was an aspiring doctor, following in her veterinarian father's well-known and respected footsteps, although she preferred to work on humans. She was extremely busy as a pre-med student and was excelling in her courses. On top of her dreams she was solidly pursuing, she had been class salutatorian at Sacred Heart Academy, a member of the National Honor Society, a finalist of the National Merit Scholarship, had won Salem Elks Leadership Award, and was a member of the Marion County Youth Council. Karen was not only highly intelligent and a very impressive young woman, but she was also beautiful in a innocent, girl-next-door sort of way. She had dark brown eyes, and her thick, very dark brown, almost black hair fell past her shoulders. Karen was innocent, chaste, and very trusting. The day she was last seen, Karen had lunch and shopping plans with her mother, They had planned to meet at noon inside the restaurant within the Meyer and Frank department store. The shopping store was located in downtown Portland, only a block and a half east of the Salem Police Department and a block and a half north of the courthouse, which held the mayor and sheriff county's offices. It was daytime when she parked. The area would have been presumed to be one of the safest spots in the city. Karen Sprinker was always impeccably prompt, and when 12:15 came around, her mother was puzzled to not see her daughter at the restaurant yet. Then it was 12:30, and still no sign of Karen. Her mother at first thought maybe she got the time or even the date mixed up, but that wasn't like Karen. She left the restaurant and called home from a nearby phone booth, but no one answered. Then she returned to the restaurant and asked the hostess to tell Karen her mother had gone home and to call her there right away. When Mrs. Sprinker drove back home, Karen wasn't there, nor was she at her father's vet clinic, and he hadn't heard from her either. Karen wasn't a girl who would have left without telling them. She wasn't a rebel, nor did she have any kind of secret life. Her parents spoke to all of her friends who were just as perplexed as to where the young woman could be. They called hospitals and her dormitory back at Oregon State, but there was no sign of Karen Sprinker. When her parents finally contacted the police, even though it was protocol to wait at least 24 hours to file a missing persons report on an adult, the officers felt something was wrong. They filed the preliminary missing person report that same day. The next day, the police went to the parking garage of Meyer and Frank's department store. Karen Sprinker's abandoned car was discovered on the roof of the parking garage. It was parked neatly between the lines and the car was locked. The only items found inside were some of Karen's books. When the vehicle was taken in for testing, no blood or semen was located. There were no cigarettes in the ashtray, and the only latent prints lifted were identified as belonging to members of the Sprinker family. Investigators did notice that the steps leading down from the roof to the store entrance, although a brief walk, were very dim and eerily silent when no one was around. The door to the store entrance was also very heavy and could be awkward for a young woman to hold. It could be a dangerous few minutes for someone to be alone. Multiple reported sightings of the young woman were made to the police, but none of them panned out to be accurate. One of them involved her even hitchhiking to a hippie commune. Karen Sprinker's boyfriend was so desperate to find her that he even implanted himself into the hippie counterculture in Portland. He dressed the part to blend in, hung around for a few days, but it was a dead end. He knew in his heart that Karen never would have been part of that scene. Amongst the many reported sightings and random tips, the Salem Police Department received some bizarre information. 2 high school girls who had initially talked to a trusted neighbor woman about a peculiar person they saw in the parking garage. On the same day, Karen Sprinker went missing. The woman encouraged the girls to go talk to the police about what they saw. According to them, they first saw what they thought was a very tall and heavy woman in a dress and heels. The person was just standing in the garage as if they were waiting for someone, tugging at their girdle and fixing their nylon stockings. They were so taken back by this bizarre sight, they actually drove back up the ramp to look at the person again. Then the girls realized that it wasn't a tall, heavy woman at all, but a man dressed up as one. The police were puzzled by these details, but they didn't dismiss the strange story. It did make a weird, logical kind of sense that Karen would have been more likely to talk to or help someone in need if they appeared to be a female. By all accounts, Sharon Wood should have been the perfect victim. On April 21st, Sharon Wood, a secretary at the Portland State College History Department, left the building around 3:30 p.m. She had been very distracted that day, totally in her own world, making her an especially vulnerable target. Sharon and her husband of 7 years were having major relationship issues, and unfortunately they were headed toward a divorce. She also felt particularly bad that day. Physically, she was suffering from a middle ear infection and was getting used to wearing contact lenses. At first, she had trouble even finding her car keys, and then she couldn't remember what floor of the 8-storied parking garage her vehicle was. She thought it was in the basement. As she walked as fast as she could down to the underground level, the door slammed behind her, locking her off from any light, and more importantly, other people. Sharon soon realized that her car wasn't parked in the basement. While she was about to return to that dark, looming space between the parking levels, she became aware of a presence. It was behind her. Her gut instructed her to walk toward the daylight entrance, which was on the far side of the garage. The young woman walked as fast as she could in her heels, but within a few steps, she felt someone tapping her on the shoulder. The man was tall, very large, and had icy blue eyes. He held a gun and told her that if she didn't scream, then he wouldn't shoot her. Sharon instinctively yelled "No" inside the vacant basement, and the man approached her from behind. But when the stranger wrapped his bulky hands around her slim neck, something went wrong. The gun faced her now, and she attempted to pull and twist his fingers around it. That didn't work. But as his fat, fleshy hand passed in front of her mouth, Sharon bit down on his thumb. She bit it as hard as she could, and blood oozed into her mouth. His blood. She did her best to stop biting it, but the moment of sheer panic and terror had locked up her jaw. She could not release her grasp on his thumb. Sharon and her attacker did this bizarre dance with one another, a small young woman and this massive man. That is, until he gained the upper advantage and held onto her long hair, pulling her face to the concrete floor. The man began to beat her senselessly, banging her head against the cold, merciless ground. An oncoming vehicle appeared, saving Sharon from certain death as she began to lose consciousness. Her jaw finally unlocked, freeing her assailant's thumb from her teeth's relentless grip. The man grabbed the gun and fled. He had been forced to abort his mission. His surviving victim, an incredibly brave young woman named Sharon Wood, had a shocking story to tell the police. She had been attacked by a very large, tall man who was strangely dressed as a woman. The woman told them how she had sensed the evil, and I knew that I was going to die. So everything within her fought him. Somehow, officers never connected the vicious assault made on Sharon Wood with the eerily similar disappearance of Karen Sprinker. The next day, around 10:30 a.m., a 14-year-old girl named Leanne Brumley was assaulted. She was walking in her neighborhood when a strange large man approached her. The man grabbed her by the shoulder of her coat and shoved her between two houses. He pulled out his gun and told her that he wanted her to come with him, but that he wouldn't hurt her. He also told the little girl that he wasn't going to rape her. He wouldn't do that. Then the man tried to force her inside his vehicle. But the girl was much stronger than she appeared, and she fought off the much larger and older man, kicking and getting away. She ran away screaming at a woman in her yard to come help her. 14-year-old Leanne Brumley may have been another survivor. April 23, 1969, was the last day that 22-year-old Linda Dawn Saleh was seen. The strikingly pretty woman had ash blonde hair, blue eyes, and was supremely petite at barely above 5 feet tall. Yet she was known for being very athletic and full of feisty energy. She was madly in love with her boyfriend and had gone to Lloyd's shopping mall that day to purchase him some nice gifts for his birthday. Linda was supposed to meet him at the YMCA where he worked as a lifeguard by 6:30 p.m., but she never showed up. Her boyfriend left a few hours later and drove over to her apartment, but there was no one there. Half angry and half concerned, the young man left confused as to where his girlfriend Linda could be. The next day, Linda Soleil didn't show up at her employer's, Consolidated Freightways, which caused her family and friends great panic and fear. When she was reported missing, investigators immediately began to search for her, noting the rising cases of young missing women in the Portland and Salem area. The Oregon State Police joined local officers in Portland to conduct an extensive search of the parking garage and the grounds of Lloyd's shopping mall. There, they located her car, her prized red VW Bug. Just like Karen Sprinkler's vehicle was found, it was in the parking garage, locked and with no signs of a struggle. This incident sparked detectives to look more closely at the cases of the missing young women, and patterns began to emerge. Within 16 months, 4 young women within a 50-mile area had disappeared without a trace. No witnesses, nothing in their lifestyle or backgrounds that indicated they ran away. No one had been aware of the women having any issues with a stalker or experienced anything suspicious. There was not one piece of physical evidence. No purse, no blood, no clothing, nothing. This left investigators to believe that the perpetrator was picking at random, or rather, he had been watching until he found his prime target. The man would then follow them to a location where they were vulnerable, lure them away somehow, and however he did it lightning quick, without any signs of a struggle. Then he made them disappear. It felt to detectives like the assailant was purposely choosing his victims in different local jurisdictions to help minimize the chances that different police departments would put the pieces together. But this situation had become far too serious, and they decided to share communications across departments. Information was shared across not only the entire state of Oregon, but all 13 western states received detailed information about the missing young women and the threads tying them together. In May of that year, a fisherman was along the Bundy Bridge that overlooked the Longtom River in western Oregon. The Longtom River is a 57-mile-long tributary of freshwater river that flowed into the larger Willamette River that ran between Eugene and Corvallis. The man spotted something odd-looking floating just beneath the surface of the water. Holding onto a maple sapling, he hung out over the river's edge to look closer at the object. The fisherman almost fell in when his eyes registered what it was: a human corpse with pale skin and light hair fanning out over the river. The man jumped from the spot and flew to his car, driving to the nearest police station. When officers arrived at the Bundy Bridge, they realized the person was a young woman, and she had been weighed down with an engine transmission. The killer, though, had made a grievous error. He had misjudged the depth of the water. That, or he had either been unable or was unwilling to place the body in the middle of the river. The girl's body wasn't easy to retrieve. She was light on her own, but with a car transmission, she weighed a little under 200 pounds, making it a challenge for even the strongest of officers. The victim had been bound to the transmission with nylon cord and copper wire. Within the bonds was a reddish-toned fabric which resembled a mechanic's cloth. A beige coat still clung to her body, but she had few other garments on. She was small, with fair skin, ash blonde hair, and blue eyes. The girl was later identified as missing person Linda Dawn Soleil. Dr. William Brady, one of the foremost forensic pathologists in the country at the time, arrived to perform a preliminary examination. It was observed how Dr. Brady stood out sharply amongst the police officers and crime scene detectives. Unlike the others wearing their uniforms or protective hazardous coveralls at the scene of a murder, he was dressed so finely he appeared to be a visiting ambassador rather than a working medical examiner. Hailing from New York City before relocating to Oregon, Dr. Brady transformed the autopsy method. The coroner system is considered to be less superior than a medical examiner system because it is less thorough and less diligent. The coroner system ended in 1956 in Oregon. When Dr. Brady arrived in the state, he established the most sophisticated state medical examiner system in the country. In circumstances of a homicide or suspicious death, the body isn't allowed to be removed without formal authorization by the medical examiner. Therefore, the body can't be undressed, washed, or otherwise prepared in any manner prior to an autopsy being performed. The official cause of Linda Dawn Soleil's death was traumatic asphyxiation. Seen on the victim were the classic petechial hemorrhages, also known as pinpoint hemorrhages, on her neck, lungs, heart, and eyes, which are a result from a lack of oxygen. The hyoid bone at the back of the tongue, which is the U-shaped bone, was fractured, and there was a visible ligature mark around her neck. At least investigators could tell her family that she had died quickly. Hopefully, it would be a small comfort to her loved ones. Strangulation is a relatively merciful way to be killed. Loss of consciousness tends to occur quite fast, sometimes within a matter of seconds, and death follows in silence. During the autopsy, Dr. Brady discovered something bizarre, something that would be kept from the media. 2 needle marks were found, one on each side of Linda Soleil's rib cage, and the skin around each puncture wound had post-mortem burns. It was something that Dr. Brady nor the detectives had ever seen before. The victim also had multiple bruising, contusions, and abrasions on her body, indicating that, although petite, Linda Dawn Soleil had fought ferociously with her killer. Over the weekend after her body was discovered, half of a dozen skilled scuba divers who were part of the reserve sheriff's team thoroughly combed each part of the Long Tom River, north and south of the Bundy Bridge. They hoped to find pieces of the victim's clothing, a purse, something that belonged to her or her killer. But there was nothing there except for jumbled knots of weeds, old tires, and other junk people shouldn't have thrown into the river. The divers were freezing and beyond exhausted, but remained fully committed to doing whatever was necessary to find Linda Soleil's murderer. They may not have known the young woman, but her death and the disturbing discovery of her body had deeply affected them all. When Monday arrived, no one could have expected that it wasn't something belonging to the victim or the killer that they would discover within the cold, dark, murky waters, but another body. Only 50 feet from where Linda Soleil had been found, laid another young woman. She was barely floating at the surface, her body weighed down. The girl had been tied to a 6-cylinder vehicle engine. After 46 days of waiting, hoping, and wanting the worst case scenario to not be true, there she was. Missing person Karen Elena Sprinker had been found. Investigators were horrified to see that the engine was bound with the same kind of nylon cord and copper wiring, along with a red mechanical rag tied to the engine head. They had a serial killer. Not just any kind of serial killer either. This man was the worst kind of monster, a lust killer. Someone who would not stop unless he is stopped by law enforcement or he is dead. Detectives Jim Stovall and Gene Doherty were the 2 investigators in charge of hunting down the individual who had murdered 2 young women and may be responsible for killing more. Time was not on their side. Dr. Brady once again performed the autopsy, and just as Linda Soleil's life was taken, Karen Sprinker's official cause of death was determined to be traumatic asphyxiation. Her neck had ligature marks from a narrower band than Linda's had, likely from a rope. Karen Sprinker had on the same clothing she had worn when she was last seen, as identified by her mother, a green sweater and a green skirt. What was bizarre to detectives is how her cotton bra, which she was known to regularly wear, had been replaced. The killer had dressed her in a waist-length black brassiere that was far too large. Then they made a horrifying discovery. As Dr. Brady removed the bra, soaked clumps of brown paper towels spilled out. Karen Sprinker's breasts had been removed. Both the medical examiner and the detectives were appalled and shocked at this grisly sight. It was grotesque, disturbing, and very bizarre. The extensive search of the Longtom River would end a couple of days later. No more bodies were found. Detective Jim Stovall and Jean Doherty had little doubt that they would find the other two missing women, Linda Slauson and Jan Whitney, alive. Meanwhile, detectives Stovall, Doherty, and Salem police officer Jim Frazier, who lent a great deal of assistance to their homicide investigation, looked into all possible leads. They spent days upon days in junkyards trying to identify the auto parts that had been tied to the victims' bodies. The parts were linked to a Chevrolet model between 1953 and 1962, and the engine head weighed about 60 pounds. Tracing the parts to an individual vehicle or even vehicles was next to impossible, and there were no serial numbers for comparison. There was literally no way to identify the vehicles they had come from. The nylon cord and copper wire, in addition to the black brassiere that had been strangely placed on Karen Sprinker's corpse, were also untraceable. They were far too mass-produced to yield any valuable results. The investigation began to shift in energy and make real progress once Jim Stovall decided to take a chance on his background in criminal psychology and create a criminal profile for the offender. The killer was believed to be between 20 and 30 years old based on the age of his victims. He was likely highly intelligent, or at least of average intelligence, since the knots used to tie the bodies to the engines were intricate, indicating that the person was skilled. The perpetrator could very well be an electrician, since the copper wire was twisted in the same manner as electrical wiring is commonly found. He was either from a broken home or was a child who had a domineering mother and a weak, submissive father. This seemed obvious to Detective Stovall because the killer had an intense hatred for women based on the mutilation of Karen Sprinker's breasts and the desecration of their bodies being tossed in and weighed down by vehicle engines in a river. The offender likely had a long history of antisocial behavior. Since the women had been strangled but not beaten, their murderer probably wasn't an athlete. He also was unlikely to be steadily employed because the women had disappeared at different times of the day. What was peculiar and hadn't really been thought about until the profile was created was how the man always committed these acts toward the end of the month, as if the killer was driven by some kind of cycle. Once this criminal profile was made, Detective Stovall began to cross-compare the cases to find shared elements that could link the murders and disappearances to one individual. It seemed apparent to detectives, based on the disposal of the two bodies along the Longtom River, that the assailant was a resident or someone very familiar with the area. The man would also have to be extremely strong. Although there was an initial theory that there was more than one person committing the murders together, this was soon nixed due to the type of killer he was. Lust killers perform their acts in secret. They don't want anyone to know about their shameful, disturbing fantasies and desires. the offender would appear physically normal, since most violent sexual offenders are normal-looking, if not attractive. This helps them, of course, to gain access to victims, catching them off guard. Since the murderer had chosen his victims as far south as Eugene and as north as Portland, that meant that his safe place, his home, was somewhere in between these two areas. Corvallis or Salem was where he lived. Detective Gene Doherty literally packed up his things and moved his life over to Corvallis, where Karen Sprinker had attended Oregon State University. Along with 2 local police officers, they interviewed female co-eds day and night. They asked them if they knew Karen Sprinkler, about any guys she may have dated, any weird calls she received, or unsettling experiences she had. They then expanded this to general inquiring about the guys the girls dated themselves and whom they had contact with, or if any of them in particular stood out as strange. The officers were becoming very frustrated, conducting the same interviews day and night, until it all felt like a dead lead. But a good detective knows that all it takes is one person who knows something of importance to break open a case. One day, 3 or 4 girls described to detectives how they had received a call to their dorm from a stranger. The man knew them by their first name, but none of them knew who he was. He told them he was a Vietnam War vet and had tried to get the girls to meet him for a Coke. One of them did end up meeting him in the dormitory lounge one night. She described the man as being much older than her, like 30 years old. He was overweight. His hair was thinning. But he wasn't vulgar or rude. He was pleasant. At one point, he placed his hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "Be sad." She found that odd and even laughed when he said it, telling him she didn't feel sad about anything. Then, the strange big man said to her, "Think of those 2 girls they found in the river. Those girls who got killed. That was an awful thing that happened to them." She wasn't thrown off by the statement at the time because everyone was talking about their deaths on campus. The girl even agreed to go out with the man for a Coke. They just chit-chatted for a while, but when he left, he asked her why she agreed to go out with him. When the girl said she was just curious, the stranger said to her, "How did you know I would bring you back home and not take you to the river and strangle you?" Detectives asked the girl to make a date to meet the man in the lounge if he ever called again. She hesitated, but they assured her that she would never have to see them, just to call officers for the time he would meet her, and officers would be waiting. The detectives were in shock. Could this tall, heavy, pale-faced, freckled man with reddish blonde hair be the monster they were after? Salem detectives had been combing through the files to find any shared patterns. Then, Detective Stovall remembered the case of the 15-year-old girl, Leanne Brumley, who had been accosted and almost abducted by a large man with freckles. The suspect had told the terrified girl, "I won't rape you. I wouldn't do that." It felt to the detectives as if the assailant was protesting too much. If he hadn't planned on raping her, what had his plans been for the girl? 11 days after the girl had gone out for a Coke with this strange man, he called again. He asked her to go out, and he said he would be there in 15 minutes. The girl attempted to make excuses, saying that it was too short a notice and that she needed to wash her hair because she needed more time to be able to contact the police officers and get them over to the dorm. But the man kept insisting, so when she said she could be ready in about 45 minutes to an hour, the man agreed to wait. The girl immediately contacted the Corvallis Police Department. The detectives were pumped up and ready to take down a serial killer. When he arrived, the man instantly looked out of place. He was massive, much older than the students, and dressed very awkwardly, in a white t-shirt, wrinkled high-water slacks, and a Pendleton jacket. Local police officers Lemaire and Miller approached the man who waited near the staircase for his date, who would never show up. When they asked the man basic questions, he showed zero signs of stress or concern as to why police officers were bothering him. He said his name was Jerry Brudos. He lived in Salem but was taking care of a friend's house in the area while he was on vacation. The man provided the officers with both his family home and his friend's address. The man said he worked as an electrician, and he confessed to being married and having 2 kids. Officers had nothing to bring the man in on. They couldn't hold him for meeting up with a pretty co-ed. Police did notice that he didn't drive a GM or Chevrolet model, but a bluish-green station wagon that had seen better days. But now they finally had a name and a face to investigate and unearth the background of a potential serial predator. Detectives discovered that Jerome Brudos, known as Jerry, had been committed to the Oregon State Hospital for violent sexual offenses as a young man. There was nothing further on his criminal record which indicated he had either gotten better or he had avoided treatment. Once Detectives Stovall and Doherty began to look at the coincidences between Jerome Brudos and his victims, they were increasingly more confident they had found their suspect. In January 1968, when Linda Slauson vanished, Jerome Brudos resided in the same neighborhood she was selling encyclopedias. He had been working in Lebanon, which he would have to commute to using the I-5 freeway, the same area from where Jan Whitney had disappeared. Jerome Brudos currently worked in Halsey, which was only 6 miles away from the Long Tom River. And when Karen Sprinker went missing from the department store parking garage, Brudos' house was only a few blocks away. Investigators were anxious to have further contact with the strange man identified as Jerome Henry Brudos. Officer Frazier with the Salem Police Department made a casual visit to his residence on Center Street. The two chatted it up inside the old garage Brudos had made into his darkroom and workshop. The officer observed how the place had a plethora of ropes, knots, and even a hook that hung in the ceiling. Something about the place fascinated him, but also freaked him out. When Frazier reported back to the homicide detectives about what he had seen, he told them he would like for them to go back with him and talk to Brudos further, because he just had this feeling. When Detective Stovall arrived at Jerome Brudos' house, he was taken back, even surprised by how unthreatening the man appeared to be. He had pictured him as being this massive, oversized man who was intimidating. Instead, he was greeted by an overgrown Pillsbury Doughboy. Even worse, the guy seemed like a loser. The kind of guy that was chosen last for a team. And definitely not a man who would spark women's attention. His heavily lidded eyes sloped at the outer corners, and his chin and cheeks were overly fleshy. Detective Stovall intended to show a picture of Jerry Brudos to the girl, Leanne Brumley, who had claimed he had tried to abduct her, to confirm they were the same person. He saw that the station wagon identified as his was in the driveway. That didn't add up, since Leanne had said that the man was in a small sports car. Stovall asked Brudos if that was his only car, to which he replied it was. But when he inquired as to if he ever drove a different car, he said that sometimes he borrowed his friend's Carmen Gia. Oh, okay, thought the detective. That made more sense. Carmen Gias are small sports cars. Investigators requested to look more around Jerry Brudos' garage. Officer Fraser and Detective Stovall both saw that there were weights hanging from rope, and the knots mirrored that which bound the 2 dead girls to the engines in the Long Tom River. Both the rope and nylon cord hanging were the exact type of material and size. Brudos noticed how Officer Fraser seemed entranced by the knot. He looked at him, half smiling, and said, "You seem to be interested in that knot. Go ahead and take it if you want to. Fraser obliged and cut 2 short lengths of the rope, making sure that it included the knot. Brudos said goodbye to the detectives and they went on their way. For someone who was the prime suspect in at least 2 brutal slayings, Jerome Brudos acted as if he had not a care in the world. Detectives had nothing substantial on him. Not yet. But a serial killer always leaves their mark behind. The truth was that this second visit to his home, in particular inside his garage, had left Jerome Brudos uneasy. He knew the police were watching his every move. The next day, he contacted Salem attorney Dale Drake and requested a meeting. Brudos told Drake that he was having problems with the police, and he wanted him to investigate as to why they were looking at him. Attorney Dale Drake refused to have any retainer, and he told Brudos that he would look into it, and if necessary, he would represent him. On Wednesday, May 28th, the following day, officers served Jerome Brudos a warrant to search the 2 vehicles. The station wagon was spotless and damp. Brudos claimed that he had taken the vehicle into one of those drive-through car washes and his little boy rolled down the window. That Friday evening, Detectives Stovall and Doherty headed to Corvallis with an arrest warrant for assault with a dangerous weapon in his attack on Leanne Brumley. But the Brudos family wasn't there. Fortunately, police had been conducting 24/7 surveillance on him, and they followed the vehicle as it took off north on the I-5 freeway. Jerome Brudos had been driving, but while en route, Darcy, his wife, took over, and Jerry laid down in the back seat. Detectives followed suit behind the undercover police cars, who tailed them. As soon as the first car got close enough, they placed their siren on top of the roof and pulled them over. Detective Doherty approached the suspect's vehicle at one side, and Detective Stovall and Miller went to the other. They observed Brudos' wife sitting in the driver's seat, who looked very worried and was fumbling to retrieve her license, asking the officer what she had done wrong. Then Detective Doherty shined his flashlight in the back seat and discovered Jerome Brudos hidden underneath a blanket. Officers read him his Miranda rights, placed him under arrest, and brought him back to the Salem police station. It was all a routine procedure. That is, until Jerome Brudos undressed to change into the jail coveralls. The officers were shocked to see that this massive, everyday working man was wearing sheer women's panties. He immediately told them that he had sensitive skin. The detectives remained silent. What was perhaps even more disturbing was when Officer Fraser searched through the contents of Jerry Brudos' wallet. Inside one of the folds, hidden deeply inside, was a tiny photograph. It appeared to be a Polaroid picture that was cut into a rectangular shape, only 1 inch by 1.5 inches. The woman was nude, but the photograph was cut so that her head and her feet were not showing. Behind the girl was a Sears Craftsman tool chest. Who was this woman? And was she still alive? Officer Fraser wondered these questions to himself as he placed the image inside a glassine envelope to protect it from further damage. At the time of her husband's booking, Darcy Brudos believed that her husband had been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, but the truth was much more darker and ominous than she had ever imagined. And Jerome Brudos was narcissistic and delusional enough to believe he could get away with it all. Once the interrogation process began, Jerome Brudos strongly believed that he was smarter than any detective. He even boasted to multiple officers, as well as his lawyer Dale Drake, that he had an IQ of 166, which would indicate that his intelligence was beyond that of a genius. But like most parts of Jerry Brudos, it was all a lie. In reality, he had been tested at 105. However, in his mind, he was a genius, and he was overly confident that no investigator in the country could outwit him. Detective Stovall, who was a renowned police interrogator, considered one of the very best in the country, first sat down with the suspect. He observed how Jerome Brudos was cocky, abnormally calm, with no signs of stress or concern. Detective Stovall asked him questions similar to what you would ask someone if they were a prospective employee. 0 signs of agitation or panic were shown from the suspect. Hours later, Jerome Brudos asked to speak to him. Detective Stovall listened to the big man inquire as to how they do their job, knowing things without having any proof. He spoke of how frustrating it must be for the detectives. Detective Stovall compared it to a puzzle that slowly and gradually came together, but without knowing the cover on the box. It took time. Then he brought up Brutus's troubles back in his teens. The suspect shrugged it off like it was no big deal. It was a long time ago. He was just a kid then. Brutus kept tethering on the edges with the detective, trying to pull information from Detective Stovall, desperate to figure out what the detectives did know. Their cat-and-mouse game continued on for 3 long days, their conversations creeping closer and closer to discussing the girl's murders. Meanwhile, the suspect's wife, Darcy Brudos, received a bizarre call from jail. Her husband asked her to go inside his workshop and locate 2 boxes, one with women's clothing and another which held photographs. He wanted her to burn them. When Darcy asked him as to why, Jerry simply said that the police were asking a lot of questions, and he was afraid they would try to use the items against him. But Darcy couldn't do it. She called his lawyer, Dale Drake, about the situation. The attorney wisely informed her that if she destroyed what could be evidence against her husband, she could be incriminated. Darcy took the lawyer's advice. She never went to the workshop, and she never told her husband, Jerry, that she didn't destroy his boxes of trophies. Instead, she packed up some clothes for herself and the kids and went to stay with her parents. The next time they spoke, it was Jerome Brudos that asked to speak to Detective Stovall. He straight up asked him, "How would you know if I did it?" Stovall played coy with him and replied, "What exactly are you talking about, Jerry?" Almost flustered, Jerry replied, "The girls. If you thought I killed the girls, how would you know anything if I didn't tell you?" Detective Stovall looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Certain things we know, certain things you know." He could see the curiosity spilling over in Jerome Brutus's mind. "What kind of things?" he asked the detective. Stovall could sense the change in him. Jerome Brudos was itching to know what the detectives knew. When Stovall mentioned that maybe he knew something about clothing that seemed out of place, Jerome Brudos then blurted out, "You must mean the bra." Detective Stovall did his best to not react to the comment, only nodding his head quietly in return. But at that moment, he knew they had the psycho who had mutilated Karen Sprinker's body and had dressed her into the black brassiere. Only the detectives, the medical examiner, and her killer knew about the black bra. Homicide investigator Stovall didn't want to scare Jerome Brudos off, as he was slowly opening up to him. So he moved on from the conversation. When they discussed his meeting the co-ed at the dormitory, Jerome Brudos told him that the girl was just someone to talk to, but that she wasn't really his type. When the detective inquired as to what kind of women were his type, he said he loved women who got really dressed up and wore high heels, stressing that he really liked shoes. Stovall observed how excited Brudos became just talking about high heels. Then he spontaneously told him that he had a collection, and he admitted to stealing them from women. Detective Stovall acted very interested in how he did that. But then Jerome Brudos clamped up, saying his lawyer doesn't want him talking to police. The detective realized then that nothing was going to stop Jerome Brudos from talking. He wanted nothing more than to brag to a captive audience, and he had Detective Stovall's full attention. Jerome Brudos began to tell the detective about a woman back in Portland, whom he saw driving around one day while working. She had on these high heels that made him fall in love at first sight. Not with the woman, but with her heels. He had to have them, so he followed her back to her apartment, jotted down the address, and returned there early in the morning. The suspect openly confessed to how he had taken off the woman's window screen, which was partially open, and entered her apartment. Brudos claimed that he was there only after her shoes, but then the woman suddenly awoke. Jerome Brudos told the detective very matter-of-factly how he had to choke the woman so she didn't see him. Then he unbuttoned her pajama top, pulled off her pants, and had sex with her. He simply stated that the woman was fine and she woke up when he was done. Jerome stole 3 pairs of her high heels and a bra. Detective Stovall asked him if that was when he stole the black bra, and he clarified that no, that was not the one they had been discussing earlier. That one had been much larger, one which he had stolen off of a clothesline a few years back in Portland. Jerome Brudos acted as if it was a perfectly normal and rational thing to do, breaking into women's homes or taking items off of clotheslines to add to his perverse collection. And most disturbingly was how he described the rape of the woman, as if it were an accident, something that just happened in the process of his trying to steal her shoes. Detective Stovall held back any expressions of shock or judgment, while Jerome Brudos spilled his stories. He didn't want anything to prevent him from sharing more. The victim would later be identified as his survivor, Joyce Lynn Cassell. When the detective asked Jerome Brudos if anything else happened while he lived in Portland, to his shock and excitement, Brudos plainly replied, "Do you mean the girl with encyclopedias?" The officer said, "Yes. Her name was Linda." Jerome Brudos then unraveled the truth behind what happened to the young woman that night. When he saw her on the street, he waved her over and invited her down to his workshop, lying to her that he had company in the main house upstairs. Then, as she sat on a stool he had offered her, he picked up a 2x4 and swung it at her head. The girl collapsed to the ground, and he choked her to death. Detective Stovall again didn't show any signs of judgment or emotion at all at his confession to the first murder. He accepted it with calmness, which invited Jerome Brudos to open up about the others. Detective Stovall listened patiently as he provided him with the horrifying details of what he had done to Linda Slauson. When Jerome Brudos was confident that Linda Slauson was dead, he stopped squeezing and just stared at her. He was overwhelmed with joy that he had at last accomplished his ultimate dream, to have a woman to do whatever he wanted with. She had no power to say no to him. First he looked at her hair, which he disapproved of. It was cut in a stylish but boyish look. All of a sudden he heard a movement upstairs. His mother and his daughter were making noise. He walked back upstairs and instructed his mother to go buy him a double cheeseburger, but he wanted her and his daughter to eat at the restaurant first before they returned with his food. His mother hemmed and hawed about the dark and the rain and how she didn't want to go out in it, but he eventually got his way. Once his mother and daughter left, he returned to the basement and looked at the young woman. Again, a loud sound interrupted his plans. This time, the footsteps were heavy, like a man's. Jerome Brudos dragged Linda's body and hid her in the dark space under the steps. He also concealed her bag of brochures and samples in the corner. Then he left through the back door and walked around to the front of the house. His workshop was detached from the main house and was connected through a breezeway. It was his friend Ned Rawls who had a key, which Jerome Brudos was really unhappy at that exact moment he had given him. Ned wanted to chat, so he had to remain calm and cool as if everything was normal. He had little time to be alone with the girl, but he had to behave as if she didn't exist. Jerome talked small talk with Ned for around 10 minutes or so, and then finally got him to leave by telling him that he had nitroglycerin he needed to take care of in the shop. When he returned to the girl, Brudos was disappointed at how boring her clothing was, but he was in for a pleasant surprise when he took them off. Underneath, she wore a blue bra, slip, and girdle with red panties. Brudos removed all of her clothing and then effortlessly redressed her. The time he had spent unhooking and rehooking the girdles of women's undergarments he had stolen throughout the years had paid off. Brudos ended up having a lot of time with her before his mother and daughter returned with his food. Yet he was still pissed off and annoyed when he heard his mother tapping on the floor. Jerome Brudos didn't have sex with the girl when he finally returned to the basement. That didn't feel necessary, having all of these beautiful undergarments of hers. He became upset with himself, though, when he realized he didn't have any film for his camera. He beat himself up for a while about that, but reminded himself that the opportunity with the girl selling encyclopedias wasn't something he had expected, much less planned. She was his for the moment, but he knew that he couldn't keep her body for too long, as it would begin to decompose. He had so many panties and bras and shoes that hers weren't necessary for his collection, but he had to have something of hers. Jerome Brudos decided to take her left foot. The saw cut clearly through her ankle, but it looked weird on its own. He decided to place it in one of her heels and then stored it inside the freezer. His mother and wife were already asleep, so it was a good time to get rid of the body. He drove out to the Willamette River and pretended he had a flat tire. Brudos tossed her body in, which he had tied an engine head to, off the bridge railing. He watched as the river pulled her body in and under, and then he drove back home. He ended up using the foot as a prop to model his other heels on for a while. That is until he became tired of it too and decided to toss the dismembered foot into the same river. Detective Stovall felt sickened and stunned by what the suspect had confessed to. But it was only the beginning, and he had to remain composed and calm and listen. Next, Jerome Brudos admitted to having abducted and murdered Jan Susan Whitney. On November 26, 1968, Jerome Brudos found an outlet for his growing anxiety around his unfulfilled fantasies that kept causing him agonizing headaches and dizziness. The young woman's vehicle had broken down on the freeway as he was driving back home from work. She wasn't alone, though, which was news to the detectives. There had been 2 guys with her, 2 hippie types. Jerome pulled over and offered to help fix her car, but he didn't have his tools on him, so all 3 of them drove with him towards Salem. He dropped the 2 guys off at an on-ramp so they could head north, and drove Jan back to his residence. He then lied to her and said that his wife wasn't home yet and he didn't have his keys. Brudos struck up a bizarre conversation with the girl. He said to her how it was a funny thing to ask someone to close their eyes while trying to explain how to tie a shoe, since they can't see. The girl turned around to face him and began to emulate tying a shoe with her hands. Brudos clarified that that isn't what he meant, and he had her face back toward the front and asked her to instruct him what to do without using her hands. Then he pulled out a mailman's leather strap he had gotten from the house when he pretended he couldn't enter it, made a loop around her head, and tightened the ligature around her throat. He opened the rear door and pulled his end of the strap through the door and closed it. This in turn pulled the girl back and bent her into a backwards position on the seat. She wasn't moving. Brudos returned back to his house to make sure his wife hadn't come back yet from her friends. Fortunately, Darcy wasn't home, so he went back to the vehicle and had sex with the girl's dead body. Detective Stovall felt the nausea rising, and as much as he wanted to bolt from the room, away from this sick, predatory monster, he wouldn't allow himself to budge. That wasn't the end of the story. Jerome Brudos next dragged Jan's remains back to his workshop. Later on in the night, he sexually satisfied himself again with her corpse and dressed her from pieces of his collection, capturing the moments on film. Brudos hung Jan Whitney up on the rope that he and Fraser had seen on the ceiling in his garage that day, never imagining the worst possible scenario could ever happen. The girl hung there for several days. Each day after work, he would pull her down, dress her up, have sex with her decomposing body, and capture each moment with more pictures. But Brudos wanted something more of hers, something he could have forever. He got the idea of making a paperweight from her breast. Jerome Brudos discussed the mutilation and desecration of the woman's body as if he were discussing a mechanical or engineering process. He cut off her right breast, skinned it, and stretched it on a sawdust mound, tacking its edges to a board. Then he made a mold using plastic, but he added too much hardener, and the final product just wasn't what he was hoping for. This kind of fetish-induced body mutilation was extremely rare. The only person up to that point known in history was the psychotic, mother-hating loner Ed Gain, who had killed his mother and another older woman and crafted vests from their skin. Jerome Brudos's bragging voice interrupted Detective Stovall's thoughts, telling him how the police almost caught him that Thanksgiving weekend. This was the first Detective Stovall had heard of the incident, since it wasn't under their division. 2 days later, after Jerome Brudos had abducted Jan Whitney, a car spun out of control and crashed into their garage while he and his family were away on holiday. It caused damage to the structure and punched a hole in the exterior wall. Since the doors were all locked, investigators were unable to determine the extent of the damage the accident caused. An officer left a card and asked for the owner to contact them. That same weekend, the vehicle had struck Jerome Brudos's garage. Jan Whitney's body was hanging in his workshop. When Jerome returned from the Thanksgiving holiday, he contacted the Salem police accident officer and unlocked the door so he could judge the damage done inside the garage. When the officer left, he nailed boards over the fractured wood, and his torture shop was sealed off again. To think, if the police had pried into his workshop a bit closer on that initial day of the wreck, they would have seen the girl hanging, and 2 innocent young women's lives may have been spared. Then he later disposed of her in the river. When Detective Stovall pressed him on whether it was the Willamette or maybe the Long Tom River, Jerome Brudos clammed up. It was as if he was so delusional that he believed he would get away with her murder if they couldn't find her remains. He also admitted to having used his car to tow hers back to the rest stop where the police discovered her abandoned vehicle. The one thing Jerome Brudos was really dumb about was the law. But even Stovall had to admit to himself that a confession wasn't always enough. In almost every sensationalized murder case, especially those involving serial homicide, half a dozen or more men will come forward claiming to be the culprit. Whether it's a matter of their own distorted self-perception that desperately is craving attention, fame, or they're mentally ill, it was a fact that men confessed to crimes they didn't commit. Without a body, even the most graphic and grotesque of details that Jerome Brudos provided the police with may not hold up in court without a way to prove how the women were killed. Detective Stovall was scrutinous and diligent with every detail Jerome Brudos gave him. Every time he left the interrogation room, he would pass his notes over to Detective Frazier and others on the team to look into each piece of his story. Even if not every piece that he spoke about fit, there was nothing that could explain Jerome Brudos being aware of the long black bra, a detail he offered up that no one knew about. It would be a gross understatement that Detective Stovall was overwhelmed by the horror of Jerome Brudos' crimes, but he knew he had to return to listen to more. It was for the girls, these young women whose voices had been silenced by this monster. He had to do it for them. Next time Detective Stovall met with the suspect, he learned about the doomed fate of Karen Sprinker. That day, Jerome Brudos decided to drive around the area near the department store Meyer and Frank. Despite the fact that he was feeling terrible, actually too lazy to even work that day, he watched and got really excited when he spotted a young woman wearing a miniskirt and high heels. He parked in the store's parking garage and searched for the girl for more than an hour in the department store, but he never spotted her again. So Jerome Brudos gave up and decided to leave. While walking back, he spotted a different girl. He thought she was pretty, so as she was about to pull open the door between the garage and the department store, he grabbed her by the shoulder. The girl turned around to see a pistol pointing at her. Brudos lied, telling her that if she doesn't scream, he wouldn't hurt her. If she came with him, he wouldn't harm her. Then he forced the girl into his vehicle and drove her back to his house and put her inside the garage. Jerome Brudos asked the girl if she had ever been with a man before, to which she said no. She was a virgin, and she was on her period. This startled the detective, as no one but them knew Karen Sprinker had been on her period when she disappeared. Jerome Brudos then flatly confessed to having raped the girl on his workshop floor. The girl never fought him off or resisted at all, believing him when he said he wouldn't kill her if she did what he wanted. He even allowed her to use the bathroom inside the house, since his wife Darcy was away. When she returned, he dressed her in clothes and shoes and took a lot of pictures of her. Karen Sprinker still believed he would let her go. Instead, Brudos tied her hands behind her back, placed a rope around her neck, and using his come-along, which hoisted her up on the hook. A come-along is a handheld, lever-operated tool that is used to pull, lift, or stretch heavy loads. Brudos pulled it once more and asked her if it was too tight, to which Karen weakly replied yes. Then he pulled it 3 more times, lifting her off the ground completely. He watched as her feet kicked until she took her last breath. After having some family time, Jerome Brudos later returned to the workshop to have sex with her dead body. He wanted to attempt making more paperweights, so he cut off both of Karen Sprinker's breasts and made some. He spoke of how he was still a bit disappointed and how they turned out, but told Detective Stovall how they were much better than the other girl. Jan Whitney? Stovall pointed out his victim's name to him. They were only dolls to him. Nameless, pretty young women, playthings he plucked off the street to fulfill his vile sexual fantasies. Detective Stovall had to force himself to stay focused on what mattered most, getting this evil maniac away from women and girls for good. Jerome Brudos continued on with his monologue. He discussed how he dressed Karen Sprinker in the long black brassiere, which now Brudos couldn't recall where or whom he had stolen it from. He piled up paper towels in there to stop her from bleeding in the car. He weighed her body down with the engine head and dumped it in the Long Tom River. Stovall asked him about where the pictures were of Karen Sprinker now. Jerome Brudos smiled victoriously at the detective, saying they were all gone. They had all been destroyed. Little did he know that the one woman he trusted and loved, to the extent he was capable of doing, had not done what he had asked of her. Not this time. Darcy Brudos had betrayed him. Detective Stovall had to take a break from speaking with this twisted, disgusting piece of filth, who went on and on as if he had a captive audience eager to listen to the next chapter of horror. He wasn't, but sooner than later, he would have to listen to more and pretend he didn't want to carve out his own ears or conceal his desire to call him out for the monster Jerome Brudos was. While Detective Stovall spent some time decompressing from the nightmares of what Jerome Brudos put these young women and their bodies through, he expressed no remorse, showed no guilt or care in the world except for his own needs. He endlessly whined about the conditions in jail, the terrible food, the uncomfortable bed, how much he wanted to see and speak to Darcy and the kids. Next was Linda Dawn Soleil. But Jerome Brudos first was anxious to reveal that he had 2 failures along the way: his assault on Sharon Wood and the attempted abduction of Leanne Brumley. Then it was Linda Soleil's turn. He almost laughed about how easy it was to get her to come with him, showing her his fake police badge and making up a story about taking her in for shoplifting. As they drove to his house and into the garage, Brudos was not expecting to see his wife home. He had instructed the girl to follow him into the house, but then Darcy appeared out of nowhere on the back porch, telling him dinner was ready soon. Brudos lied to his wife and said, "Go back inside the house and stay there," while he finished up something important in his workshop. He dragged Linda in there, tied her up, and then went to eat dinner with Darcy and the kids. What was even crazier than the fact that this psychopath was casually having a family dinner while a young woman was tied up in his workshop was how when Brudos returned later on, the girl had loosened up the knot. The girl had not attempted to escape. There was even a phone out there which she could have used to call the cops, but she did nothing to leave. She just stood there, as if waiting for him to return. It was beyond bizarre, but only Linda Soleil knows what happened that day and why she was still there. Sometimes, in moments of terror and panic, people freeze. They become immobile and aren't able to run, paralyzed in fear. Or maybe it was just another in an endless parade of delusions Jerome Brudos held and told himself. Brudos admitted to Detective Stovall how Linda Soleil had fought him off. She struggled and battled with him tirelessly until he managed to get the postal strap around her neck and pull her off the ground. As she was hoisted up using his come-along, the girl turned to him and asked, "Why are you doing this to me?" To this, Jerome Brudos just pulled the strap tighter, and the tiny girl's body went limp. He laid her on the floor and sexually assaulted her as she died. This girl had kicked him and scratched him and went to war with him, trying to live. In Jerome Brudos's mind, that had to be punished. he hung her up on the hook in the ceiling as the others before her. But this time, Brutus decided to experiment on the girl. He went on to describe to Detective Stovall how he had stuck 2 hypodermic needles, one on each side of her rib cage, and attached electric leads to them. Brutus then plugged in the leads to watch what her corpse would do. What would it do? Would it dance? But to his disappointment, it only burned her flesh. This is why she had the burn marks, Stovall realized. That made sense now. It had really puzzled both him and Dr. Brady. Jerome Brutus attempted to make more paperweights from her breasts, placing cones over them instead of cutting them off, but it didn't work because the epoxy got too hot. He described the process to Detective Stovall, whether he wanted to hear it or not. When a breast was salted down and dried, they shrunk to 1/3 of the size, so he never got to make a perfect mold. Brutus kept her body for another night before tossing her body, way down with the engine, in the Long Tom River. It was too much for Detective Stovall to absorb or digest. Jerome Brutus was the monster of all serial killers. Thank God he would never have the opportunity to perfect his breast paperweights or ever place a rope around a young woman's neck again. Detective Stovall wondered if he would be able to eat or sleep normally ever again. On June 2nd, 1969, the media and the public finally got a name and face to the monster who had been hunting and killing young women in their communities. Marion County District Attorney Gary Gortmaker announced a charge of first-degree murder against then 30-year-old Jerome Henry Brutus, a Salem electrician, for the death of 19-year-old Karen Elena Sprinker. This ends part 1 of the Shoe Fetish Slayer. Next episode, I will explore the horrific discoveries made during the search of his property, the criminal trial, and discuss the dark depths of the life and mind of serial killer Jerome Henry Brutus. Please be sure to follow the show so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. Your support and your feedback means everything. So please make sure to leave a rating and leave a review. It really makes a difference. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas for future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. You can find my contact information in the description below. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.